Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1893, and winter had descended upon the Ozark Hollow with unusual ferocity. In the remote corners of Shannon County, Missouri, where the Boston Mountains cast long shadows across isolated homesteads, a trapper named Thomas Blackwood failed to make his monthly journey into the settlement of Eminence to trade his furs and purchase supplies. This absence might have gone unnoticed in such wilderness were it not for the peculiar circumstances that preceded it. 3 consecutive nights of smoke billowing from his cabin chimney despite the snowfall, and the unexpected appearance of his mule wandering alone into town, still saddled but riderless. What followed would become one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in the Ozarks, a case that remained buried in county records until a historian named Dr. Edwin Palmer uncovered it while researching the region's folklore in 1963. The documents he found painted a picture far more disturbing than any mountain legend. Thomas Blackwood was known throughout Shannon County as a skilled trapper and huntsman who had moved to the region from Tennessee some 15 years prior. He lived alone in a sturdy log cabin he had built himself, nestled between Jack's Fork River and what locals called Dead Man's Ridge, a name that would later seem prophetic. Blackwood was described in town records as a man of few words but reliable character who paid his debts and kept to himself. The storekeeper in Eminence, William Thornton, noted in his ledger that Blackwood's last visit had been unusual. He had purchased double his normal supplies and had inquired about the price of passage on a steamboat to St. Louis, something he had never done before. What makes this detail particularly noteworthy is that Blackwood had always professed a deep aversion to cities. According to Thornton's personal journal discovered decades later, Blackwood once stated that the crush of humanity in such places makes the air unbreathable. His sudden interest in St. Louis suggested a profound change in his circumstances, or perhaps a desperate need to escape something worse than the crowds he so despised. According to what remains of Sheriff Marcus Holloway's report, dated December 18, 1893, a search party was formed after Blackwood's mule appeared in town on December 14th. The men who volunteered were reluctant to venture deep into the hollow during winter, but duty and curiosity compelled them forward. What they discovered at Blackwood's cabin would haunt the region for decades. The cabin door stood ajar, swinging gently in the winter wind. Inside, the hearth was cold, though ashes piled unusually high suggested recent and prolonged burning. There was no sign of violence or struggle, yet Blackwood's most necessary possessions remained. His hunting rifle hung above the mantel, his winter coat was folded on his bed, and a half-written letter sat on his crude wooden table. The letter, addressed to a Margaret, presumed to be his sister in Tennessee, contained only a few lines. "I fear the arrangement I have made may have been in error. The man from the ridge has returned 3 times now. If I do not write again by spring, tell Reverend Woodward what happened to our father." This cryptic reference to Blackwood's father would later gain significance when Palmer discovered church records from eastern Tennessee indicating that a Jonathan Blackwood had died under unusual circumstances in 1865. The records were vague, noting only that the elder Blackwood had succumbed to a wasting condition following an encounter in the high woods. The attending clergyman, Reverend Samuel Woodward, had written in the margins, "The man raved about an arrangement gone wrong. May God have mercy." What puzzled the search party most was the state of Blackwood's cellar. The trap door to the root cellar was secured with a new padlock, something Blackwood had never previously owned, according to those who knew him. When broken open, the cellar revealed shelves stripped bare of preserved foods, yet in the center of the dirt floor sat a peculiar arrangement, a circle of small animal bones surrounding a leather-bound journal that was open to its final entry. The journal was taken as evidence by Sheriff Holloway, and according to Dr. Staub Palmer's research, its contents were so disturbing that the sheriff sealed it away in the county records rather than make it public. Sheriff Holloway, by all accounts a practical man not given to fancy, became noticeably changed after reading Blackwood's journal. His deputy, James Garfield, no relation to the former president, noted in his own records that the sheriff began to insist on keeping a fire burning in his office at all times, even during mild weather. More tellingly, he refused to discuss the contents of the journal except to say that some knowledge sits like ash in the mouth, fine and choking. The search for Thomas Blackwood continued for 3 days, expanding outward from his cabin in ever-widening circles. On the third day, the men discovered a set of 2 pairs of footprints leading away from the cabin toward Dead Man's Ridge. One set matched Blackwood's distinctive boots with a repaired heel. The other set was described as unusual in both size and pattern, longer than any man's foot in the county, and with what appeared to be modified soles. The tracks led the search party to the base of the ridge, but disappeared among the rocky terrain. As darkness approached, the men, already uneasy, refused to continue the search up the ridge after one of them claimed to hear a sound like a man trying to speak with a throat full of ashes. This description, a throat full of ashes, would recur throughout the historical record in relation to Dead Man's Ridge. It appears in diary entries, local folklore, and even in a poem published in the Eminence Gazette in 1905, which described the ashen-voiced wanderer of the high paths. The consistency of this imagery across sources that had no apparent connection to one another lends an unsettling weight to what might otherwise be dismissed as frontier superstition. The official report concluded that Thomas Blackwood had likely become disoriented in the winter conditions and perished somewhere on the ridge. His body was never recovered, and the case was closed. But what the official report failed to mention, and what Dr. Palmer discovered in his research, was that 3 other men had disappeared from the same area over the previous decade, all during winter months, and all without explanation. The first documented disappearance was that of a French-Canadian trapper named Jean Bouchard in the winter of 1883. Like Blackwood, Bouchard lived alone in a cabin near the base of the ridge. His disappearance was noted only because he failed to deliver promised furs to a trader in Eminence. When the trader eventually visited Bouchard's cabin, he found it abandoned but intact, with a circle of ash surrounding the cold hearth. No search was organized, and the incident was attributed to the transient nature of frontier life. In 1887, a surveyor working for a lumber company, Harold Wilson, vanished while mapping the ridge area. His equipment was found neatly arranged beside a campfire that, according to his assistant, had been burning continuously for 3 days before Wilson walked into the woods and never returned. The assistant reported that Wilson had been visited twice by an unusually tall man whom he described as speaking with a voice that seemed to catch on itself like breath through cinders. No trace of Wilson was ever found, though his assistant claimed to have discovered a perfect circle of ash at the spot where he last saw Wilson enter the trees. The third disappearance, in 1890, was that of a botanist named Charles Everett, who had come to the Ozarks to document plant species. Everett kept meticulous records of his findings, which were discovered in his abandoned camp. The final entry described his encounter with a tall figure on the ridge who claimed knowledge of a rare plant that grew only in a specific cave. Everett wrote that he had agreed to follow the stranger to this location the next day. The journal ended there, but the page was marked by what appeared to be a small circle of ash pressed into the paper. It was not until Dr. Palmer gained access to Sheriff Holloway's personal correspondence that the true nature of the case began to emerge. In a letter to his brother, a physician in St. Louis, Holloway described the contents of Blackwood's journal. The trapper had apparently encountered a stranger on the ridge during a hunting expedition in early November 1893. The stranger, whom Blackwood described as uncommonly tall, and dressed in furs so old they had nearly turned to dust, claimed to be a prospector who had discovered something of great value on the ridge. He proposed a mutually beneficial arrangement to Blackwood. In exchange for shelter during the harshest winter nights and a share of Blackwood's provisions, he would lead the trapper to his discovery when spring came. What's particularly notable about this encounter is the timing. Blackwood's journal entry describing the meeting was dated November 2, 1893, the day after Samhain in Celtic tradition, or All Souls' Day in the Christian calendar. This timing aligns with numerous folklore traditions in which the barrier between the living and the dead is believed to be thinnest. Whether this timing was coincidental or significant remains a matter of speculation, but Palmer noted the pattern in his research, observing that each of the documented disappearances occurred during what folklorists call the dark half of the year. Blackwood agreed, but as the entries progressed, his writing grew increasingly disturbed. He described his visitor as speaking with an accent I cannot place, using words that seem almost but not quite English. More troublingly, he noted that the man never seemed to sleep, would stand motionless for hours staring at the fire, and despite eating from Blackwood's provisions, never seemed to produce any human waste. The final entries documented Blackwood's growing suspicion that the stranger was not leaving during the days as he claimed, but was instead hiding somewhere on his property, watching him. One particularly disturbing entry, dated December 4th, read, "Awoke at midnight to find him standing over my bed, perfectly still, watching me breathe. When I stirred, he smiled and said, 'Sleep is a kind of small death, is it not?' A rehearsal for the final silence. I did not sleep again that night." The last coherent entry, dated December 11, 1893, read, "I have made a terrible mistake. Last night I pretended to sleep and saw him removing something from beneath his furs. What I first took to be a map, but now know is something far older. The markings upon it are like nothing I have ever seen. When he noticed my watching, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. He said our arrangement was nearly complete, that 3 more nights would seal our compact. I plan to leave tomorrow for Eminence and will not return. May God forgive me for letting this thing into my home." Sheriff Holloway's letter ended with a disturbing detail omitted from the official report. When the search party examined the ashes in Blackwood's hearth, they found what appeared to be fragments of human teeth and small pieces of charred bone that could not have belonged to any animal common to the region. What gives this detail particular weight is that Holloway was known in the county as an experienced huntsman, familiar with the anatomy of local wildlife. For him to state definitively that the bone fragments were human and unlike any animal native to the Ozarks suggests a level of certainty that cannot be easily dismissed. Moreover, his decision to omit this detail from the official record indicates a reluctance to acknowledge possibilities that fell outside his understanding of the natural world. The locals in Eminence spoke little of Blackwood's disappearance after the initial search was abandoned. According to town records, the few who mentioned his name did so in hushed tones, and the settlement experienced an unusually harsh winter following his disappearance. The storekeeper, William Thornton, reported in his business ledger that sales of protective charms and religious items increased dramatically that winter, and several families moved away before spring arrived, citing unwholesome influences in the area. Of particular note was the account of Martha Ledbetter, a widow who lived on the outskirts of Eminence. In a letter to her daughter in Kansas City, dated January 1894, she described waking one night to find what she initially thought was frost on her windows, intricate patterns that seemed to form a circle with strange markings inside. By morning, the patterns had melted, leaving behind a residue that she described as fine gray powder, like ash, but somehow different. She noted that her dogs refused to come near the windows afterward and would growl at the tree line beyond her property at dusk. Ledbetter's experience might be dismissed as the imagination of an elderly woman troubled by recent events, were it not for similar accounts from other residents. The local physician, Dr. Hiram Wells documented 3 cases that winter of patients complaining of ash-like substances appearing in their homes overnight, always in circular patterns. Wells, an educated man trained in Boston, initially attributed these reports to hysteria following Blackwood's disappearance, but later confessed in his medical journal that he had experienced a similar phenomenon himself, waking to find a perfect circle of fine gray powder surrounding his bed, with no explanation for how it had appeared. The historical record shows that the cabin Blackwood had built remained abandoned for nearly 7 years after his disappearance. In 1900, a young couple from Illinois purchased the property, unaware of its history. According to county records, they lasted less than a season before abandoning it, claiming that the place was unwholesome and that they were plagued by sounds in the walls and ash appearing in circles around their beds. The property reverted to county ownership and was eventually reclaimed by the forest, its exact location lost to time until Dr. Palmer's investigations decades later. Their description of their experiences, recorded in a letter to the county clerk requesting the sale be voided, matched the patterns established years earlier: circles of ash, a sense of being watched, and what they described as a tall shadow that stands just at the edge of the lamplight, speaking in whispers that sound like cinders being crushed. The connection between Thomas Blackwood's fate and what happened in the decades that followed might have remained severed were it not for a curious discovery made in 1917. What makes the couple's account particularly credible is that they had no knowledge of Blackwood's disappearance or the folklore that had developed around it. During the construction of a new county road, workers uncovered what appeared to be the remains of an old root cellar approximately half a mile from where Blackwood's cabin was believed to have stood. Inside, they found a metal box containing a journal written by a man named Samuel Thorne, dated 1885-1886. Thorne described himself as a geologist, examining the mineral composition of the ridge for potential mining operations. His early entries were scientific and methodical, but by midwinter, the tone of his writing changed dramatically. He began to describe encounters with what he called the resident of the high places, a figure he initially mistook for a hermit or mountain man, but later came to believe was something else entirely. Thorne's final entry, dated February 19, 1886, read, "It has offered me knowledge beyond what any man should possess. All it asks in return is shelter during the coldest nights and a place beside my fire. I have accepted its arrangement, though I cannot shake the feeling that I am missing some crucial detail of our compact. It assures me that all will become clear on the 3rd night." What gives Thorne's journal particular significance is that it predates Blackwood's experience by nearly a decade, yet describes an almost identical pattern: an encounter on the ridge, an arrangement or compact, and a growing sense of unease as the 3rd night approached. Moreover, Thorne had no connection to Blackwood or the other men who disappeared near the ridge. He was an educated man from Philadelphia with no knowledge of local folklore or the previous disappearances. Yet his description of the tall stranger, with his archaic speech and unsettling presence, matched the accounts that would follow. Samuel Thorne was never heard from again, and his journal would likely have remained forgotten had the county clerk not recognized similarities to the Blackwood case and preserved it in the archives. Dr. Oz. Palmer discovered both journals during his research in 1963, noting the disturbing parallels between them. Both men had encountered a strange figure on the ridge, both had entered into an arrangement or compact, and both had disappeared after recording their unease about the true nature of the agreement. The pattern extended beyond these 2 documented cases. Dr. Palmer uncovered evidence of similar disappearances dating back to the earliest European settlement of the region: a French trapper in 1822, a land surveyor in 1849, and a circuit-riding preacher in 1873. In each case, the missing men had been alone in the vicinity of what would later be called Dead Man's Ridge, had last been seen during winter months, and their disappearances were preceded by reports of unusual smoke or fire activity at their dwellings. The case of the circuit-riding preacher, Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, deserves particular attention. Unlike the other men who disappeared, Mayhew left behind a detailed account of his encounters with what he called the Ash Walker. In a letter to his bishop dated January 15, 1873, Mayhew described meeting a tall stranger on the ridge who engaged him in theological debate. According to Mayhew, the stranger displayed knowledge of obscure religious texts and spoke of having witnessed events from biblical times with an unsettling familiarity. Mayhew wrote that he initially believed he had encountered a fellow scholar, but became disturbed when the man began to question the nature of resurrection and the concept of bodily remains. The stranger reportedly asked Mayhew if he believed that ash could retain the essence of a person, and whether fire was destruction or transformation. The preacher's final letter, sent 3 days before his disappearance, expressed his intention to convert this lost soul who speaks of arrangements and compacts as if they were sacraments. Mayhew was last seen riding toward Dead Man's Ridge during a snowstorm. The Osage had apparently considered the area taboo, referring to it in their oral traditions as the place where the ash-maker walks. Their stories told of an ancient entity that emerged during the coldest moons, offering knowledge or treasure in exchange for the warmth of hearth and home. Those who accepted such offers were said to become food for the fire that burns without light. One Osage elder, interviewed by an anthropologist in 1932, described the entity as older than the mountains, hungry for warmth and company. According to the elder, the Osage believed that the entity had once been human, but had made a bargain with something beyond human understanding, gaining immortality at the cost of consuming others to maintain its existence. His horse returned alone 3 days later with a circle of ash on its saddle. Even more disturbing were the fragments of Osage Indian legends that Palmer discovered relating to the ridge. The elder claimed that his ancestors had placed warning markers around the ridge, but these had been removed or destroyed by European settlers who did not understand their significance. These Native American accounts added historical depth to what might otherwise have been dismissed as isolated incidents or frontier misfortune. The pattern they revealed suggested something that had been present in the Ozarks long before European settlement, something that operated according to rules and cycles that transcended human understanding. What makes these accounts particularly credible is their consistency across cultures and time periods. The Osage legends, recorded decades before Palmer's research and centuries after the tribe had left the region, describe the same pattern of behavior, a tall figure emerging during winter, offering arrangements or compacts, and leaving only ash behind. This cross-cultural continuity suggests something more substantive than merely shared folklore or coincidence. Dr. Palmer's fascination with these connections led him to expand his research beyond documentary evidence. In the fall of 1963, he began interviewing elderly residents of Shannon County, recording their memories and folklore related to Dead Man's Ridge. One recurring motif in these accounts was the appearance of ash circles, perfect rings of gray powder found around homes, on windowsills, or surrounding personal possessions. These circles were reportedly most common during winter months and were considered an omen of impending misfortune. Gertrude Wilson, age 93, at the time of her interview, recounted a story from her childhood in the 1880s. Her family's farm had bordered the hollow where Blackwood would later build his cabin. She described how her father had once given shelter to a tall stranger during a snowstorm, allowing him to sleep near their hearth. The next morning the stranger was gone, but they found a circle of ash around their father's chair. Within a week, her father began to complain of feeling watched whenever he worked in the fields near the ridge. He grew increasingly agitated, spending long hours staring into their fireplace. On the night of the first full moon after the stranger's visit, her father announced he was going to settle things with the man on the ridge, and walked out into a blizzard. His body was never found, though search parties reported finding a trail of ash leading from their cabin toward Dead Man's Ridge. Wilson's account included a detail that connected directly to Blackwood's journal. She remembered her father mentioning that the stranger had offered to show him something of value, hidden on the ridge in exchange for shelter during the 3 coldest nights of winter. This specific arrangement, 3 nights of shelter in exchange for treasure, appears consistently across the accounts Palmer collected, despite the witnesses having no knowledge of one another's experiences or the contents of Blackwood's journal. Another elderly resident, Joseph Carter, recalled a story told by his grandfather about a hunting trip near the ridge in the 1850s. According to the tale, the grandfather's group had encountered a tall man, dressed in ancient-looking furs, who requested to warm himself at their fire. The hunters agreed but became uneasy when the stranger began asking each man what he desired most in life, offering to arrange for them to receive it. One hunter apparently accepted the offer, agreeing to meet the stranger on the ridge 3 days later. He never returned from that meeting, and when the others searched for him, they found only a circle of ash where he had presumably met the stranger. Such accounts might be dismissed as the embellished memories of elderly people were it not for their consistency with the documentary evidence Palmer had uncovered. The pattern was too specific, too coherent to be merely coincidental. A stranger's appearance, an arrangement or compact, circles of ash, and ultimately disappearance. What gave these accounts particular weight was that many of the individuals Palmer interviewed had no connection to one another and no knowledge of the Blackwood or Thorn journals. Yet they described the same phenomena, often using strikingly similar language. References to the Ash Man, the Tall One, or the Ridge Walker appeared across multiple independent accounts. One interview subject, Martha Collins, age 87, provided a first-hand account of encountering the entity in 1896, 3 years after Blackwood's disappearance. As a young woman of 20, she had been gathering herbs near the base of the ridge when she met a tall man who asked her name and whether she lived alone. When she explained that she resided with her elderly father, the stranger inquired about their hearth, asking specifically if they kept it burning through the night. Unsettled by the questions, Collins made an excuse and hurried home. That evening, she found a circle of ash on their doorstep and convinced her father to stay with relatives in Eminence until spring. When they returned to their cabin, they discovered the fireplace had been used in their absence, with an unusual amount of ash piled in the hearth. Collins insisted they move permanently to town after finding what she described as teeth-like objects among the ashes. Palmer's research culminated in a presentation to the Missouri Historical Society in Springfield in October 1963. According to attendees, he displayed photographs of locations associated with the disappearances, copies of journal entries, and maps showing the pattern of incidents clustered around Dead Man's Ridge. He concluded his presentation by announcing his intention to conduct field research in the area, stating that understanding what happened to Thomas Blackwood might shed light on a phenomenon that had claimed victims for over a century. 2 weeks later, Palmer established a research camp near the base of the ridge, approximately where Blackwood's cabin was believed to have stood. His last communication was a letter to a colleague at the Historical Society dated November 3, 1963, in which he described finding what appeared to be the remains of a cabin foundation and a root cellar partially exposed by erosion. He mentioned discovering curious circles of discoloration in the soil around the foundation and expressed his intention to excavate the cellar the following day. Palmer's letter concluded with a troubling postscript. I should mention that I've had an unusual visitor to my camp, a remarkably tall man who claims to be a local historian interested in the same cases I'm researching. There's something odd about his manner of speaking, almost archaic. Yet he demonstrates knowledge of details I've uncovered that haven't been made public. He's offered to show me a cave on the ridge where he claimed some of Blackwood's possessions might still be found. I'm naturally skeptical but intrigued enough to consider his offer. If nothing else, he may represent a living repository of local folklore I haven't yet documented. When Palmer failed to return to Springfield by his scheduled date, a search was organized. On November 28, 1963, searchers found his camp intact but abandoned. His research materials were meticulously organized in his tent, including copies of the Blackwood and Thorn journals, interview transcripts, and a partially completed manuscript titled The Ash Man of Ozark Hollow. His excavation tools lay neatly arranged beside the partially excavated root cellar. The only sign of disturbance was a perfect circle of ash surrounding his campfire pit, which contained the charred remains of what appeared to be papers or a journal. One member of the search party, a forest ranger named David Hoffman, reported finding a trail of footprints leading from Palmer's tent toward the ridge. He followed them for approximately half a mile before they disappeared among the rocks. Hoffman noted two unusual aspects of the tracks. They showed no signs of hurry or distress, suggesting Palmer had walked willingly toward the ridge, and at certain points they were accompanied by a second set of prints that Hoffman described as unusually long and narrow, with a stride no normal man could manage. The official report concluded that Palmer had likely become lost in the increasingly harsh weather conditions. Despite an extensive search involving dogs and experienced trackers, no trace of him was ever found beyond his camp. The case was classified as another tragic accident in difficult terrain, and public interest quickly faded. However, those familiar with his research could not help but notice the disturbing parallels between Palmer's disappearance and the historical cases he had been investigating. The county clerk who had granted Palmer access to the archives later reported that when she attempted to refile the original documents after his disappearance, she discovered that Sheriff Holloway's correspondence, the Blackwood Journal, and the Thorn Journal had all vanished from the records. In their place was a single sheet of paper bearing a circle drawn in what appeared to be ash. The official explanation was clerical error or possible theft, but the clerk maintained until her retirement that something more unsettling had occurred. In a private letter to Palmer's widow, the clerk wrote, "I fear your husband found what he was looking for, though not in the way he intended. The records are gone as if they never existed, yet I handled them myself. I've begun to find small circles of ash on my windowsill each morning, and last night I dreamed of a tall figure standing by my bed asking if I would like to make an arrangement. I'm leaving Eminence at the end of the month and suggest you burn any research materials your husband sent home. Some knowledge should remain buried on that ridge." In 1965, a geological survey team working in the Ozarks reported finding an unusual cave entrance near Dead Man's Ridge, in an area that had been thoroughly mapped previously, with no such feature noted. The interior of the cave showed signs of long-term human habitation, including a crude stone hearth containing layers of ash mixed with what the team leader described as small fragments of bone and what appeared to be personal effects, buttons, metal clasps, and what might have been a pocket watch, all damaged by extreme heat. Most disturbing were the markings found on the cave walls, symbols arranged in circular patterns that one team member, who had studied anthropology, described as similar to Native American pictographs but fundamentally wrong in execution and meaning. He noted that the symbols seemed to change slightly when viewed from different angles or in different light conditions, an effect he attributed to mineral properties in the pigments used. The team collected samples of the ash from the hearth for analysis, but before a thorough documentation of the cave could be completed, a sudden landslide completely obscured the entrance. Subsequent attempts to relocate it were unsuccessful, with survey maps showing solid rock face where the opening had been. The team leader later admitted that several members had experienced unusual dreams and sensations of being watched while working near the cave, and that on their final night of camping in the area, they had awakened to find perfect circles of ash surrounding their tents. Laboratory analysis of the ash samples revealed anomalies that defied explanation. The ash contained carbon consistent with burned organic material as expected, but also showed traces of minerals not common to the region and compounds that could not be readily identified. More disturbing was the discovery of microscopic fragments that the lab technician described as possibly human dental material subjected to temperatures far exceeding normal cremation. The samples were sent to a more advanced facility for further analysis, but were reportedly lost in transit. The connection between Thomas Blackwood's disappearance in 1893, the historical pattern Palmer had uncovered, and the events of the 1960s might seem tenuous were it not for one final piece of evidence. Among Dr. Palmer's effects found at his abandoned campsite was a journal containing his field notes. The final entry described his discovery of what appeared to be the remains of a cabin foundation near the base of the ridge, roughly matching the location of Blackwood's home. While excavating the site, Palmer claimed to have uncovered a small metal box containing a folded piece of animal skin with markings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. He included a rough sketch of the markings, which he noted reminded him of the description in Blackwood's journal. The final lines of Palmer's journal read, "There is someone or something moving around my camp at night. At first, I thought it might be a bear or mountain lion, but the movements are too deliberate, too human. Last night I woke to find ashes scattered in a circle around my tent. I'm certain they weren't there when I retired. I've decided to pack up and return to Springfield tomorrow. There is something deeply wrong about this place, and I fear Blackwood's visitor may still be here, waiting for another arrangement." A postscript, written in a noticeably shakier hand, added, "The historian I mentioned has just visited again. He knows about the skin I found. Impossible. I told no one. He's offered to explain the markings if I'll share my fire with him for 3 nights. Says it's too dangerous to travel the ridge in darkness." I refused, but he smiled as if he expected that. "The arrangement always completes itself," he said. "The compact will be sealed. I'm leaving at first light." The historical record falls silent after Palmer's disappearance, but local folklore in Shannon County took on new dimensions. Residents began to report sightings of what they called the Ash Man, an unusually tall figure seen at a distance, standing motionless among the trees during winter months. Some claimed that homes near the ridge would occasionally find circles of ashes around their properties in the morning, with no explanation for their appearance. What makes these modern accounts particularly noteworthy is their consistency with historical patterns, despite many of the individuals having no knowledge of Palmer's research or the earlier disappearances. The phenomenon they described matched the details in Blackwood's journal and the accounts Palmer had collected: a tall figure, circles of ash, and a sense of being watched that preceded each encounter. In 1967, a forestry worker named Raymond Kelly reported a strange experience while marking trees near Dead Man's Ridge. He described taking shelter from a sudden snowstorm in what appeared to be a shallow cave or rock overhang. While waiting out the storm, he noticed unusual markings on the rock walls, circular patterns that seemed to have been burned rather than carved or painted. As he examined them more closely, he became aware of what he described as a tall shadow standing at the entrance to the overhang. According to Kelly's account, filed with the U.S. Forest Service and later obtained through a Freedom of Information request, the figure introduced itself as a surveyor who had been working in the area for a very long time. It offered to show Kelly something of great value further up the ridge in exchange for sharing his campfire that night. When Kelly refused, citing the need to return to his base camp, the figure remained silent for a long moment before saying, "Perhaps another will accept the arrangement." It then walked away into the blizzard, leaving no tracks in the fresh snow. Kelly reported that when he returned to the same location the following day with colleagues, they could find no cave or overhang matching his description, only a solid rock face marked with a perfect circle of ash approximately 6 feet in diameter. His supervisor attributed the experience to disorientation and possible hallucinations caused by hypothermia, but Kelly maintained the accuracy of his account and requested a transfer to another district shortly afterward. In his request for transfer, Kelly noted that he had begun to experience unusual dreams in which he stood before a fire, feeding personal possessions into the flames while a tall figure watched. More disturbing was his claim that he had awakened several times to find small circles of ash on his bedsheets, despite living alone and keeping his cabin meticulously clean. His supervisor denied any connection between these experiences and his work near the ridge, but approved the transfer on medical grounds, noting that Kelly appeared to be suffering from exhaustion and possible nervous strain. In 1968, the last documented connection to the Blackwood case emerged when a retired forest ranger named James Harmon came forward with an unusual story. Harmon claimed that in the winter of 1944, while patrolling the remote areas around Dead Man's Ridge, he encountered a tall man dressed in furs who asked for directions to the nearest settlement. Thinking him a trapper or hermit, Harmon provided directions to Eminence. The man thanked him and asked the year, which Harmon found odd, but attributed to the isolation of mountain life. As they parted ways, Harmon noticed something unusual. Despite the freezing temperatures, the stranger left no visible breath in the cold air. More disturbing still, when Harmon returned along the same trail hours later, he found a perfect circle of ashes where they had stood talking. In the center lay a small animal bone, blackened as if burned. Harmon kept this experience to himself for decades, fearing ridicule, until hearing about Palmer's research in a local newspaper. Furthermore, Harmon reported that after this encounter, he suffered from recurring nightmares in which he found himself standing before a fire, watching as something wearing his own face fed pages of a journal into the flames, whispering, "3 nights to seal our compact." Harmon's decision to come forward after so many years was prompted by a disturbing development. He had begun to find small circles of ash on his property, always in the morning, always in locations where he had spent time the previous day. What gives Harmon's account particular weight is that he had no knowledge of Blackwood's journal or its contents, yet his description of the stranger matched the details written 70 years earlier. He reported feeling watched when alone in his home, and had taken to keeping his fireplace cold and empty despite the winter chill. In a written statement provided to the Historical Society, Harmon expressed his belief that by speaking about his encounter, he had somehow renewed the arrangement that had lain dormant for decades. The consistency of these accounts across time suggests something persistent in the Ozark Hollow, something that operates according to patterns established long before European settlement of the region. The Osage legends of the Ashmaker find their echo in the experiences of Blackwood, Thorne, Palmer, and others who encountered something ancient and other on Dead Man's Ridge, something that offers arrangements, forms compacts, and collects payment in ways that leave only ash behind. The geological and archaeological record offers tantalizing hints about what this entity might be. The cave discovered in 1965 contained not only evidence of habitation, but also curious mineral formations that the survey team described as anthropomorphic in appearance, yet clearly natural in origin. Analysis of ash samples collected from the cave hearth revealed unusual properties. The ash contained traces of minerals not common to the region and organic compounds that could not be readily identified with the technology available at the time. More recently, a 1968 soil survey of the area around Dead Man's Ridge found unusual concentrations of rare earth elements in patterns that formed rough circles around the base of the formation. The geologist who conducted the survey noted that such concentrations would typically indicate either volcanic activity or deliberate deposition by human activity, neither of which could explain their presence in the Ozarks. He suggested that water flowing through underground caverns might have created natural mineral deposits, but acknowledged that this would not account for their circular arrangement. The scientific explanations offered for these phenomena remain unsatisfying, attempts to force the inexplicable into frameworks that cannot contain it. The circular patterns of minerals, the ash with its unidentifiable components, the cave that appeared and disappeared, these defy conventional understanding, suggesting something that operates according to principles beyond current scientific knowledge. The Blackwood case represents a disturbing convergence of documented fact and regional folklore. What began as a simple disappearance reveals, upon closer inspection, a pattern stretching across decades. Whether Thomas Blackwood encountered a flesh-and-blood killer, fell victim to the harsh winter conditions, or met something that defies conventional explanation, remains unknown. What we do know is that the ridge that claimed him has claimed others since, and the accounts that survive share unsettling similarities. A tall stranger, an arrangement or compact, and the residue of ash marking each disappearance. The official records may have vanished, but the pattern they revealed remains, etched into the history of Ozark Hollow like the mysterious markings in that cave, visible to those who know where to look, meaningful to those who understand what they represent. The most unsettling aspect of the Blackwood case and the pattern it reveals is not what we know, but what remains hidden. The journals that might have provided answers have vanished or been destroyed. The locations associated with the disappearances have been obscured by time, weather, and perhaps deliberate intervention. Even the names have been changed. Dead Man's Ridge appears on modern maps under a more innocuous designation, and the hollow where Blackwood's cabin stood has been reclassified in Forest Service documents. This systematic obscuring of the record suggests something more than bureaucratic oversight or the natural erosion of history. It suggests a deliberate effort to disconnect the present from a pattern that stretches back through the centuries, as if something understands that knowledge of its existence, its methods, and its hunger might make potential victims more wary of its approach. Shannon County has changed since Blackwood's time. The hollow where his cabin stood has been reclaimed by the forest. Dead Man's Ridge appears on modern maps under a different, more innocuous name. But locals still avoid certain areas when winter sets in, and old-timers warn against making deals with strangers who emerge from the wilderness during the coldest months. Perhaps most telling is that in the County Historical Society, where records of births, deaths, and land transactions are meticulously preserved, there exists a conspicuous gap in the archives. When asked about records from 1893 or the research of Dr. Edwin Palmer, the current county historian, simply shakes her head and suggests looking elsewhere. Some histories, she says, are best left undisturbed. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In 1967, a surveyor working near the former location of Blackwood's cabin reported finding a rusted metal box containing what appeared to be journal pages, nearly disintegrated with age and exposure. Before he could preserve them properly, he claimed that a sudden gust of wind scattered the fragile papers into a nearby ravine. He managed to read only a few lines, which he later recalled as, "The arrangement requires ash. He says ash purifies and preserves. I do not know what he means, but the fire must be kept burning." The surveyor reported his find to local authorities, but no recovery attempt was made. Within a year, he had relocated to another state, reportedly after experiencing increasingly vivid nightmares about circles of ash and a tall figure standing at the foot of his bed. Before leaving, he confided in a colleague that he sometimes woke to find small deposits of ash on his windowsill, despite living alone. In the years since, others who have ventured too close to the pattern have reported similar experiences. A graduate student researching Ozark folklore in 1966 described waking to find perfect circles of ash around her tent while camping near the ridge. A photographer working on a book about abandoned settlements in 1967 captured what appeared to be a tall figure standing among distant trees near the site of Blackwood's cabin. When the film was developed, the figure appeared as a vertical smudge that analysts described as consistent with ash blown by wind. As researchers attempting to document this case, We have encountered unusual resistance. Records that should exist are missing. Individuals connected to the case become reluctant to speak when they learn our subject of interest. Even the descendants of Sheriff Holloway declined to be interviewed, with one simply stating, "Some things in the Ozarks are best left alone. My grandfather learned that, and so should you." What emerges from the fragments that remain is a portrait not just of a man who disappeared, but of something that has persisted in the shadows of the Ozark Mountains for generations. Something that makes arrangements, collects what is due, and leaves behind nothing but ash and stories too disturbing to be fully believed, yet too consistent to be dismissed. The most recent connection to this pattern occurred in early 1968, when an archaeological team surveying historical sites in Shannon County reported finding unusual ash deposits at multiple locations associated with 19th century settlements. Analysis of the ash revealed it to be human in origin, cremated remains that contained traces of multiple individuals spanning different time periods, some dating back over a century based on associated artifacts. The archaeologist who conducted the analysis described the findings as consistent with ritualistic deposition rather than conventional burial practices, noting that the ash had been arranged in precise circles at each location. The team's final report included a curious footnote. During their survey, they had encountered an unusually tall man who identified himself as a local historian, interested in their work. He had asked detailed questions about their findings and methods before departing. The next morning, the team discovered that their field notes regarding the ash deposits had vanished, replaced by circles of fresh ash on their work tables. The case was reported to local authorities but dismissed as a prank. The lead archaeologist requested that the team be reassigned to another project, citing hostile local elements interfering with their research. Thomas Blackwood's final journey from his cabin to whatever fate awaited him on Dead Man's Ridge may have occurred in 1893, but the path he walked remains open. The compact he described in his journal, the arrangement that filled him with such dread in his final days, seems to have claimed others since. Dr. Palmer may have been the last documented victim, but regional newspapers still occasionally report hikers or campers who vanish in that area, their belongings found neatly arranged, often surrounded by unexplained circles of ash. The most recent connection to this disturbing pattern came in 1968, when an elderly woman named Eleanor Thornton, a descendant of the storekeeper who had known Blackwood, donated a collection of family papers to the County Historical Society. Among them was a letter her grandfather had written but never sent, dated December 1893. In it, he confessed that Blackwood had seemed deeply troubled during his last visit to the store, and had tried to explain something about a man from the ridge who was not a man at all. According to the letter, Blackwood had whispered to Thornton that he had made a terrible mistake by inviting something ancient into his home, and that he feared it would not let him leave. Thornton had dismissed these concerns as the ramblings of a man too long in isolation. The letter concluded with an expression of guilt that he had not taken Blackwood's fears seriously or alerted the sheriff before the trapper returned to his cabin for the last time. Eleanor Thornton reported that after donating this letter, she began to find small circles of ash on her porch each morning. After the third occurrence, she awoke to find a tall figure standing at the edge of her property, watching her house. The sightings ceased when she retrieved the letter from the Historical Society and burned it in her fireplace. She claimed that as the paper burned, she heard what sounded like a sigh of satisfaction from the empty room behind her. What gives this account particular credibility is that Eleanor Thornton had no knowledge of the pattern Palmer had documented, nor was she familiar with the details of Blackwood's journal. Yet her description of her grandfather's account matched the details recorded by Blackwood himself, and her experience following the donation of the letter followed the pattern established over decades: circles of ash, a tall watcher, and a sense of something waiting to complete an arrangement. In a final, disturbing twist to the story, The curator of the Historical Society reported that after Thornton reclaimed and destroyed the letter, every document relating to Blackwood Palmer or Dead Man's Ridge vanished from their archives overnight. In their place were small circles of ash, perfect in their symmetry, silent in their implication. The curator resigned her position shortly afterward and left the county without explanation. The case of Thomas Blackwood and whatever he encountered in the winter of 1893 remains officially unsolved. The journal that might have provided answers has vanished, along with much of the evidence that once existed. What remains are fragments: Palmer's notes, Harmon's encounter, the surveyor's discovery, and the persistent folklore of an entity that offers arrangements and collects payment in ways that leave only ash behind. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is its cyclical nature. The appearances of the Ash Man, or Ridge Walker, seem to follow a pattern tied to both season and location. Winter months bring increased reports of sightings near Dead Man's Ridge. Circles of ash appear most frequently during new moons, and those who experience these phenomena often report that the entity offers knowledge, treasure, or some other desire in exchange for shelter, companionship, or access to their hearth. An arrangement that seems benign until the third night arrives and the true nature of the compact is revealed. This cyclical pattern suggests something that operates according to rules and rhythms beyond human understanding, yet intersects with human desires and vulnerabilities in calculated ways. It knows what to offer when to appear, and how to phrase its arrangements in terms that seem reasonable until too late. As darkness falls over the Ozarks tonight, one has to wonder, does the figure Blackwood described still wander those remote ridges? Do its offers of mutually beneficial arrangements still tempt those who venture too deep into the wilderness? And what might it require to seal the compact with those who accept? The answers, like Blackwood himself, remain lost somewhere on that ridge, a place where footprints disappear among the rocks, where caves appear and vanish without explanation, and where, even now, locals report occasionally seeing a tall figure standing motionless among the trees, watching the distant lights of human habitation with patient, ancient hunger. For those inclined to dismiss this account as mere folklore or exaggeration, consider this. When researching this case, we requested access to Shannon County records from 1893. The response we received stated simply that a small fire in the archive had unfortunately damaged those specific materials beyond recovery. When asked when this fire had occurred, the clerk checked the records and appeared puzzled. "That's strange," she said. "There's no date recorded for the incident, just a note that the damaged materials were discovered one morning, with a circle of ash around them. Perhaps some arrangements continue long after those who make them are gone. Perhaps some compacts, once sealed in ash, cannot be broken. And perhaps in the remote hollows of the Ozarks, where winter nights grow long and cold, something still waits for travelers to lose their way and accept an offer of shelter, not understanding the true cost until it's too late." Thomas Blackwood understood, in the end, but by then the arrangement had been made, the visitor invited across his threshold, and the compact nearly complete. All that remained was ash that, according to Sheriff Holloway's suppressed correspondence, seemed to move slightly when disturbed, as though something still lived within it. As you listen to this account, in the safety of your home, remember that some things wait patiently for decades between arrangements, and sometimes the stories we dismiss as folklore serve as warnings, markers on a trail leading somewhere we would be wise not to follow. For those who might feel drawn to explore Dead Man's Ridge or search for what remains of Blackwood's cabin, consider why local guides refuse to lead visitors to these locations. Consider why maps of the area seem to contain deliberate inaccuracies around that particular ridge. And consider finally what it might mean to make an arrangement with something that has been collecting payment in ash for longer than anyone knows. The hollow waits. The ridge stands. And somewhere in the shadows between them, arrangements are still being offered to those who wander too far from the safety of common paths and known histories. In the winter of 1968, the final documented connection to the Blackwood case occurred when a historian attempting to follow up on Dr. Palmer's research reported finding a weathered stone marker near where Blackwood's cabin was believed to have stood. The marker bore no name or date, only a rough circle carved into the stone. Inside the circle was a single word, arranged. The historian photographed the marker, but reported that when he returned the following day with colleagues, both the marker and the clearing where it had stood seemed to have vanished, replaced by dense forest that appeared to have grown undisturbed for decades. The photograph he took showed only a blur where the marker should have been. A smudge that one colleague suggested looked remarkably like ash spread across the image. Some compacts, it seems, cannot be documented. Some arrangements resist being brought into the light, and some truths, once written in ash, fade back into the darkness from which they emerged, waiting for another winter, another visitor, and another opportunity to extend an offer that should never be accepted. The ridge still stands, the hollow still waits, and somewhere between them something ancient still moves, leaving circles of ash in its wake.